In today's lesson, we are going to talk about the Express app that we used when we ran npx Express Generator. With the npm Express Generator, we ended up with this application structure that was created for us on our system under our Express API. And when we look at this, well, you probably named it Portfolio API to go along with your, let's see, Helio. We've got Portfolio API and Portfolio UI. So we're going to look at the Portfolio API. Now, I already went through and made some edits to this one. So in my sandbox, I created a clean Express API where I'm going to show you how we modify this from a monolithic application to an API so that we can connect our React front end to the Express API backend. So to start out with, we're going to kind of go through what makes this Express app an app and what all these folders mean and all of the files we have in it. Traditionally, when we look at the documentation for Express and we do the getting started and then we do the hello world, we can really just create a single file that has just this code in it, and it will create an Express web application for us, and we can begin the server and we can respond to the root request for our website. So www.mysite.com/ and then instead of sending out HTML, it just sends text hello world. This is the simplest way for creating a new Express app. But when you're going to create a complex application, and that application is going to require a lot of different routes because we're creating an API for a whole lot of resources that we are managing within that API, we of course are going to need to make sure that we create a more complex application. And we would have to do that manually by ourselves. Fortunately, though, the Express team provided us with this Express generator, which we can run with npx, and it sets up a new app for us that already has a pretty complex structure to structure our app so that it's easier to maintain, we know where stuff's at, and we can modify it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through what all the files and folders are so we understand what an Express web application looks like and what its files are and folders and why we have those folders. Then we're going to talk about how we modify this from a monolithic app, meaning that all of the HTML pages get generated on the server and then the entire HTML page gets sent to the web browser. Instead, we're going to turn this into an API and we're going to send out the HTML through our profile UI, which is a single page React app. And then that is going to communicate with our API. So to start off with, let's look and see how this is set up to be a monolithic app where all of the HTML is created and generated by the server and sent to the browser. And then we'll talk about how we convert it so that it only sends JSON back and forth from the server to the client. So here in this bin folder, bin just usually means it's where the executable file lives inside of an application. And so in this bin file, we have a www folder or file. And the www file, it pretty much is this basic code from the hello world where we create a React, we import Express, and then we have a port that we're going to run it on, and we have a response to handle an incoming GET request to the default URL. So that's pretty much what is in here. We're importing app, we're importing the Express API server, we're importing HTTP, and then it's got a few more things in there. We've got the actual create HTTP server, the port that it's going to listen on, the error handling, and then the listening handler right there. And then we've got some of these handlers here. So it's a little bit more complex, but if we look at it, it's really just the ports, setting up the server, providing an error handler if we have an error, and then event listening for while the server is running so that it can spit out information about what's happening. So if there's an error, and then down here, as it's listening, it'll show you what port it's listening on. So a little bit more complex than the default, but it's really just the file that is the executable inside of our application that kicks on the server and sets up our app to begin running. So that's all the bin and www is for. Node modules, we know that's where all of the dependent node modules are stored that are being used by this. Of course, those are listed in our package.json. We've got our dependencies right here. You've got your Express, your HTTP errors, debug, cookie parser, Jade, and Morgan. Of course, Jade is our templating engine, which we'll get to in a minute. But all of those are, of course, installed in our node modules folder, which we don't mess with. The public folder right here, it usually holds images that you're going to be serving out as part of your pages, JavaScript that's going to be included in your pages, and then style sheets that will be included in your pages. Now remember, when we first executed the Express generator, it set up an Express monolithic app, which means all of your UI components and all of your HTML pages are going to be generated within this app and sent out to the user. And then it is also going to handle your middle tier and your data access layer. And then you'll have your database server. So it is the monolithic. In other words, it has all of those components built into it. Nothing has been pulled out to separate concerns. Now, we're not going to be using all of the functionality of a monolith. So really, this public folder really does us no good. So we can leave it or we can actually delete it. We can leave it if we are still going to have this app handle browser requests to our API where we can tell people, hey, this is an API server, you can't hit it directly. So let's talk about the routes folder. It holds in here a router file. So it's a module that actually imports an Express router. We set up the routes for the paths within our website that we want to handle, and then we export that router. Same thing here with users. We've got a user router. It, of course, handles the slash or the root path for the users, and then exports that router. Now, Express routers are middleware. So if you remember, middleware gets added to our app.js. We import it. So here we've got those two routers. They get imported. And then we actually have to tell Express to use those routers as middleware to handle requests. Here's where we can see that the index router handles the default or root path of the website. And we see that here. And then the users router, it actually handles this default path. Now, the cool thing about the router middleware is that you can set what the root path is for the router, and then you don't have to type this on every single one of your routes that you handle inside this file. Instead of everything will be based off of this root. So when we see this, it's the router will handle tacking on slash users slash. So that slash users that we see here is the root that gets passed to this router. The router will handle tagging that on right here. So it would be users like that. But so that we don't have to retype that constantly every time we create a new route down the page, we can just handle the path that happens after users. So if anything would be like slash or slash users, so users slash profiles or something like that. And then we would just have in this file a slash profiles to handle that. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, make sure you ask questions. Make sure you go read the documentation on router, and hopefully it'll all make sense. So these are the routers. In all reality, we don't really have any users yet because we're not implementing authentication, but we're going to leave this user's router because in the future we will implement authentication and authorization, and we will be using this user's router in order to handle all the paths that have to do with authenticating a user, creating a new user, updating passwords, and that kind of stuff. Now, to understand what this views folder is and how the Jade helps us build the HTML that gets sent out from a monolithic app, we're going to look at our index first. Here you can see when we get the slash, so the index for the root of our application within this router, we see that instead of just a response.send, we have a response.render. When you call response.render, what happens is Express is looking for an HTML rendering or templating engine. And the engine, this view engine right here, is Jade. So we have imported, or we have as one of our dependencies when we look in our JSON, the Jade library. And so in our app here, we're actually telling Express that whenever it receives a response.render, it is going to be using a view engine, and it tells it where the views are at, so where our HTML pages are going to be. And then it tells Express that we're going to be using a view engine called Jade. And when we pass this, then Jade, this particular package right here that was written by somebody else that is a view engine, will then actually take over rendering our responses that are set up right here. And so when we say response.render, because in our app.json file, in our app.js, we set what the view folders is, in other words, where the views live, and then we tell it we're using the Jade view engine. When it passes in index, it's automatically going to go look for this view folder, which is what was set up right here for views. It'll find this view folder, and then it will look for a view or an HTML document, in this case, a Jade file that knows how to generate HTML. And it will look for the one with the same name as index, which means it'll find this index.jade file. And so if we open up that index.jade, you can see here first that it extends layout. So the cool thing about a view engine within a monolithic app is that you can have a default layout that all other pages get rendered into as content. So let's see how that works right here. We've got this layout right here, and you can see it's not regular pure HTML. It is a simplified version of HTML just to make writing HTML easier. That's what Jade is. It's a markup language that is more simple than regular HTML because it removes the opening and closing tags and all that kind of stuff. So it just makes it easier to write HTML, but you can see it uses the exact same HTML element names. So here inside of our layout, you see that it has the root layout for all of our pages. It's going to have the doc type for HTML. It's going to have the root HTML element, a head with a title and a link to the style sheet. It's going to have the body. And then right here where it says block content, this is a special function of Jade where when we have a template or when we have a partial, that's what this is called, is a partial that extends layout. When this gets rendered into HTML and it says that it relies on this layout, it's going to generate this HTML to build the actual HTML that goes back to the browser. And when it runs into this block content, it's going to look inside of the index.jade file, which is the one specified right here in our render. It's going to begin rendering this content that's in here, and then whatever is within this block content, you can see that block content matches block content. This stuff that's all here within this block is going to be generated into HTML, and it will be stuffed into the layout right here. And that's how we can have multiple partials injected into a primary layout. And we can have one layout for all of our web pages so they all look and feel the same, but the actual content that's within the body of that HTML document actually comes from one of these partials. And these partials are what are rendered upon one of our router requests. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, rewatch the video, re-listen to it, ask your instructor, ask a peer, and go read the Jade documentation if you're really interested in it. We're not going to be really working with Jade a lot because we're building an API, which means we're just going to be pushing JSON data back and forth between our UI and our API. But we are going to use it to handle any requests that come to our application that are not from or not through a JavaScript asynchronous request that just asks for JSON. So if they're asking for full HTML, we want to let them know that this is an API application, not an HTML web application. It's an API application that spits back JSON. So how we do that is we can actually mess around with our layout, our index, and our index.js router file. And we can do that here. And we can see what happens when these get compiled together by simply running our app. So if I open up my terminal, and then I do npm start, this will start up my web server. And based on my www file, you can see I have port 3000 right here, but that's actually what we're going to be running our React app on. So I'm going to change that to port 8080, and then I am going to go ahead and Control C to stop this. I'm going to restart it, and now we should see it running on port 8080, which means I should be able to open up my browser. I should be able to go to localhost, port 8080, and if I do a slash, we should get an HTML page back. So if we inspect this, we will see it is an HTML page here, and we can actually see this HTML page follows the structure of our Jade layout. So we've got a doc type, we've got the doc type, we've got an HTML primary right there, we've got ourselves a head, it has a title and a link, which is a title and a link, we've got a body, and in that body, it doesn't say block content, instead it's got an H1 and a P tag, and that is because when we actually hit the root path, it actually rendered the index partial. So here's the index partial. Oops, I kind of modified it. Let's undo that. You can see it's got an H1 and a P. We've got an H1 and a P. Now the question is, where does this content, Express and welcome to Express, come from? Where is this content coming from? Because it's not, well, the welcome to is there, but Express isn't and Express isn't. But you can see we have ourselves JavaScript variables that are being injected into our partial here. And we can see that here in our router, when we say response.render and we name the partial, we can actually send an object that is full of key value pairs. This will then be sent into the Jade partial, and then the individual key value pairs that are inside of this object can then be used as variables inside of our Jade layout. So to show you how that works, we've got our title Express. Well, we're going to change that to I think I've got cap locks on, my profile API. So we're identifying that this is a profile API. And instead of just having a title and rendering that also as a message, we're going to go ahead and add another one, and we're going to call it message. And then we're going to go ahead and give a message. This is a JSON API server and must be accessed through our React single page application. So here we're giving them kind of a message or a warning that they're trying to use our API incorrectly, and they'll get it back as HTML because they're trying to hit it with a browser. So it's good to kind of have this Jade along with our index template so that we can actually let people know that when they hit our API server instead of our single page React app, they know that they need to go do that instead. So this will give them a warning. Now, right now, we're still just using title. We're not using message yet inside of our partial, but we should be able to stop this with Control-C, restart our server, refresh our page, and we should see that it now says My Profile API, welcome to My Profile API. Well, we had in here a new message that we wanted to give. We didn't want to welcome people, we wanted to warn them. So what we can do is we can go back here, and instead of title, we can use message. And then when we Control-C to stop this, we restart the service, we reload the page. Now we've got their error message. This is a JSON API server and must be accessed via our React. Now you might ask yourself, why does this have an equals and why does this have a pound curly brace? Well, before we removed what was here before, Jade is treating this as a string that will be inside of this p tag. And when we do strings, we've got to do string interpolation, which means we're injecting an JavaScript variable that has content into this string. So whenever you're doing string interpolation, you need to make sure that you use the pound curly brace, because that tells Jade that you are trying to merge these strings together. Now, since we got rid of the string and we are not doing any interpolation, we can actually just go ahead and set it to p equals, and then whatever's in here will become the content. So let's go ahead and Control-C, restart our service, come back, reload our page, and My Profile API, this is a JSON. You can see that we still got the message back because we're using equals, because we are not interpolating a string right here. We are simply making the value of this variable the message. So now we have a response for anybody who hits our website at the root URL, letting them know in HTML that comes back to a browser that a browser can read and understand that this is an API server and you really can't hit it with a browser. You need to hit it with a React app. So that kind of gives you a brief introduction to the Jade View Engine. or templating slash partial engine. It's a view engine. It has templates or layouts, and then partials, which get injected into your layouts using the block. And we're just going to leave that just for handling people coming to our website with a browser. So we're going to go ahead and close all of those because we're not interested in them anymore now that we understand what they're doing and how they do it. Now we're going to go back and we are going to talk about routes. Now, inside of our API for our profile, we have several resources that we're going to need to create Crud operators for that will be sending back and forth data in the form of JSON instead of HTML. Now, how do we do that? Well, it's as easy as adding another router, just like we have here for users. So let's go ahead and copy all of this content here. So just Command C, go to routers, click new, and we're going to do a new JavaScript file. And we are going to call this one profiles, because in our application, we are going to have a resource called profiles. So let's go ahead and add a profiles router. And in here, we're going to have to make sure we import Express, import the Express router, and then, of course, export that module. And then we've got ourselves a default right here. Now, when we do a response.send, or we do a response. If we look at our index, response.render, and we use a partial, what we're going to want to do, instead of using render, which of course asks for the view and then starts to use the view engine, we don't want to use the view engine. We want to simply send back JSON data. Now for this example, and while we're mocking up our API endpoints, in other words, we're creating actual endpoints that we can integrate with we can begin to develop against with our React app, we're going to send back just dummy data to start out with before we implement our data access layer. And to do that, we just need a dummy dummy JSON object that we can send back every time one of our API endpoints responds to one of the HTTP methods like get, put, post, and delete that correspond to our CRUD operators, or create, read, update, and delete. And we're going to do that simply by making sure we note by putting a to-do and say, need to build mongoose schema. So we still need to build our data access layer. So we're going to put that to-do in there. And then to-do, this is a dummy profile object for API mockup. And then we need to make sure we remove it. Remove after data, or DAL, data access layer, DAL is built. So those are kind of just things to remind us why we're doing what we're doing. And we're going to do const, and we're going to do dummy profile, because this is just dummy data. Keep that in mind. This isn't something we're going to use permanently. It's temporary. And then for our profiles, we're going to make sure it has the exact same attributes as we designed inside of our data model that we created. So underscore ID is what we're going to get back. Underscore ID is what we're going to get back from MongoDB every time an entity is created. So we're going to go ahead and have a dummy ID, and then we're going to have name. So this is probably going to have the name of the person. And then we're going to go ahead and have other profile information. So you're going to go ahead and build out your full object based on your data model that we designed. So I'm going to stop right there just to keep this a short demo. But make sure you do a full object, because when you're building your React app against this dummy piece of data that comes back from your API, you're going to want it to be true to your data model. The questions on that, please let me know. All right. Now, right here, we've got a root URL for profiles, but we have not yet set up profiles for this router to respond inside of our app. So if I do a Control-C and I restart my app, and we go back to our browser, and I try to hit /profiles, we're going to get a 404 not found, because we have not taken this router and implemented it yet. Every time we create a new router, we have to go back to our app.js. We have to import that router. So I'm going to go ahead and put a note right here. API routers go here. All right. And so I'm going to go ahead and add this new router. So let profiles router equal require, and then we're going to go ahead and it's a local file, so we do /routes/ and then profiles. So this imports the module that has our router in it, but then we have to tell React to actually use it as middleware. So down here, you can see if I do note and we document this, API routers set to intercept requests as middleware. So now we go down here and we say app.use. This is where we tell the Express app to use our profiles router. Now, because we're doing profiles, we want to have a root profiles path that our router is going to respond to, or it's going to be mapped to. And then we do our profiles router right here. Now, because we have our default path that's assigned to this router, in here, we can simply go ahead and use the slash instead of /profiles/. So here we've got one that will respond to the list request, right? So we've got create, read, update, and delete, but we also usually have a list, which is where we get all of the profiles back. And that would usually bring you back all the profiles that live within that collection. Now, of course, we want to send back our dummy profile right here. So just to keep this simple and just for mocking up our UI, we're just going to wrap this inside of a JavaScript array so that it looks like it's a list. And we're just going to have that one profile inside of it. And then I'm going to go ahead and mark this so that we know to do replace dummy data once DAL implemented. So once our data access layer is implemented. So now we have a root path that responds to the get method of HTTP. We've imported our router. We've set it to act as middleware to handle this path that comes in. Now, if we go ahead and restart our web server, you always got to make sure you restart. Sometimes you'll forget and then you'll go to your browser and things won't work and you'll wonder why. So we got our profiles path, hit enter, and here you can see we got back an array with that object in it, which is exactly what we want to have happen when somebody calls the get method on this router for profiles. We're going to send back a list of dummy profile data so that we can begin building against it with our React app until we get our mongoose schemas built and we actually start implementing the business logic for manipulating and modifying those objects before they get stored or when they get retrieved from the database. We can also implement other ones like post, and this would be, of course, for creating a new one. So we can do function, and that takes in a request, a response, and a next. And then in this one, because we are creating, right, post equates to create, get to read or list, we're going to go ahead and we're going to do the exact same thing here. We're going to go ahead and respond with a profile, but it should respond with just a single profile, and that would be the profile that has been created. When we're done in this logic, of course, what's going to happen is it's going to pull in the data from the body that makes up the new profile. It's going to call our mongoose schema. It's going to create a new entity. It's going to go into MongoDB, and then we're going to get back that object, and it'll have a brand new ID. So right now, since we're mocking it up, we're just simply going to respond with that dummy profile as though it was created. Now, of course, to test all of this, we are going to use Postman as we're stubbing out or creating all of our API endpoints. And so as we're doing that in a browser, we can't really mock a post. We can do a lot of gets, but we can't really do a post. So we're going to use Postman. So make sure you get Postman installed. And we're going to use Postman to actually make our post requests to test to make sure that this API endpoint is actually active. So we just barely added this post here. So we're going to need to stop our service, restart our application. And now we're going to go ahead and looks like it's going to Make me sign in again. Oh my goodness, it forgot me. Okay, here we go. So I'm gonna go ahead and do a new, we'll just go ahead and add a new one right down here. Do a new collection. And I'm gonna call this profile API. Click create. Down here in my profile, I'm gonna go ahead and create a new request. So add a request. Request name is going to be create profile. Okay, so now I've got this create profile. So now we know we're going at localhost port 8080/profiles. And then of course, instead of a get method, we're gonna use a post method. And when we click send, we should get back our dummy data. And as long as our dummy data follows our data model exactly, we can actually go ahead and program our entire React front end off of dummy data without ever actually needing to implement the API yet, just by having stubbed out dummy data endpoints that provide the correct data back to us. We could actually go build our entire React front end from all of this stubbed off stuff, and then actually go implement our backend or our middle tier right here to store and save data. So right now the task is to simply go through, modify your Express app to be an API application instead of a strictly monolith. Begin creating a new router for every single one of your resources, and then start stubbing out all of your CRUD operations for that resource, sending back, of course, the appropriate dummy data. In this case, the get is a list, so it'd send back a list. In this case, once an object is created, it's going to send that exact object back. That way you have the new ID. And then if we do a router.get and we want to get a specific item, we would, of course, pass an ID as a parameter. And then, of course, we'd have our function with our request, response, and next, and then, oops, it already did that. And then in here, we would actually, go to the database, find that item with that ID, and then we would respond with it. But since we're just stubbing all these out and creating dummy data, so all of your profile routers should have about 5 CRUD operators. You should have your create, read, update, and delete, which means your get, put, post, and delete. And then you should have a second get, which gets all of the items in that collection. And then you've got a get that handles just a specific item with a specific ID. So there should be 5 CRUD or API endpoints for CRUDing in each of your profile, each of your resource routes. All right, so let's go ahead and implement all of that, and that'll be what we do this evening.